But there was no permanent Spanish colonies in North America like that.
I mean, my father is Anglo-Saxon. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right. Now, where did he come from? Well, where did his family come from?
Somewhere in England. I couldn't even tell you. I never met the guy.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. England. Yeah. Now, how hard was that? That wasn't so hard at all, was it?
No. No, I didn't.
Okay. Now, what's on your mind? What's on your mind, sir?
Why is slavery bad?
Why is slavery bad? For obvious reasons. Because it mistreats people, and slavery is basically you harming and mistreating and controlling a person, and that person doesn't know how to stop it. That's all slavery is. Now, why would you ask, why is slavery bad?
Well, because white people were slaves too at one point to other white. Well, because white people were slaves too at one point to other white. People.
Was it bad? Was it bad when they were enslaved?
That's what I'm asking you.
Was it bad when white people were enslaved at one point?
It's difficult to answer. I am not nearly smart enough to be able to answer that.
Yeah, slavery was bad. When any mistreatment is bad, and the fact that you think that there's some type of caveat to mistreatment, oh man, what kind of mentality do you have? Do you think mistreating people is good in any shape, form, or fashion? No mistreatment is good, sir.
What about the purchase of death row inmates as slaves? Death row inmates as slaves.
All of that is bad. They shouldn't have been on. Why are they on death row?
Take a pick.
And what death row inmates are you talking about? Because this is a lot of weird whataboutisms. What are you talking about?
Just what I said. Death row inmates. Is a guy would be able to purchase death row inmates as slaves. Is a guy would be able to purchase death row inmates as slaves.
I don't know. When did death row inmates be purchased as slaves? When did death row inmates be purchased as slaves? Sounds like this is a lot of deflective whataboutisms to kind of justify enslaving and mistreating black people. Is that what this is? Is that what this is? Okay. All right. Well, he muted his own microphone. His microphone is not on. And I guess he ran out of troll material. Let's get Cobra in here. I guess he ran out of troll material. Let me get him out of here. He just muted his mic and I haven't heard from him. All right, Cobra, let's hop on, bro.
What's going on, Lexus?
What's going on, bro? How you doing?
I'm all right. So, yeah, that last speaker is the definition of your room, the TWT.
Yeah, I'm wasting troll.
Welcome to the Aboriginal channel. On this episode, we're going to talk about that thing that Tariq doesn't know nothing about. And according to his logic, if he don't know about it, then it's dumb talk or it's trolling. You're just trolling. So the caller, the white, he asked Tariq if the enslavement of those on death row was right, if he thought that was right. So he was basically getting at the fact that white people were slaves and a lot of them were convicted and facing death in Europe and were given the opportunity to live, but only by being slaves in the colonies. So right here is talking about before Humphrey Gilbert's scheme. Now, Humphrey Gilbert was a very vicious dude. Look him up. But he's the one who came up with the idea to bring convicts to the colonies as slaves. So it says there were precedents for Gilbert's scheme. So there were people who did it before Gilbert. Convict labor had featured from the earliest European forays in the Americas. In Spain, the difficulties of persuading free men to try their luck in the unknown had prompted King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1497 to promise a pardon to convicts facing death if they would agree to go on Christopher Columbus's third expedition. So in 1497, The people that were facing death in the prisons in Spain and Portugal were Jews and Moors, because they had just kicked them out and enslaved them and imprisoned them in 1492. But it goes on to say half a century later, so in the mid 1500s, the Marquis de la Roche, an old adversary of Gilbert's, took his pick from the Britain jails to man successive expeditions to parts of the New World that Gilbert had an eye on. It was said that De La Rocha's ships were deep freighted with vice. So that meant he had a bunch of death row inmates in his ships in the mid 1500s. So moving on over here, it says Gilbert's blueprint covered everything from the size of the first colony, a mere 9 million acres, right down to the street layouts and the number of churches. In retrospect, the most significant part of his plan was the suggestions of where to find the colony's manpower. He proposed transporting such needy people of our country, which now trouble the Commonwealth and through want here at home are forced to commit outrageous offenses whereby they are daily consumed with the gallows. That means they are daily consumed, put to death. So he proposed, since they're being put to death anyway, let's just ship them and enslave them in the colonies. When the caller said the people that were facing death being enslaved, this is what he's talking about. The foundation of so-called the United States. Right here it says in 1578, he set sail with a large fleet and 500 men, including at least one convict who had been reprieved from execution and handed over to him. So there's another example of how those who were facing execution were reprieved with a future of enslavement in the colonies. It says his 27-year-old half-brother Walter, which is Walter Riley, furnished his own ship and came too. For Gilbert, it must have been a mouth-watering prospect. The royal license entitled him to total control over a land expected to be awash with gold and silver, just like the Spanish-American colonies. But a combination of bad luck, infighting, bad weather, and bad leadership turned the expedition into a disaster when it was barely out of English waters. A decimated fleet returned home without even crossing the Atlantic. So I read all that because it's on a side note to say that this is the route I was talking about. It says, undeterred, Gilbert tried again in 1583 without Riley this time. He followed in the track of the fishing fleets to the Grand Banks. And that was the route I was saying that they always took, from the islands off of the British Isles to Iceland to the Grand Banks, and then he landed at Newfoundland, Canada. Then after Gilbert, another guy came along. His name was Hakluyt. Says Hakluyt had just published his first major work on geography when Riley, with his rare eye for young talent, hired him to write about America. The result was a persuasive piece of propaganda, the discourse concerning Western planting, echoing Gilbert's theme of an England being engulfed by the lawless poor and America as her salvation. Hakluyt claimed that the country was so populous that people were ready to eat up one another. In their desperation, so many had turned to crime that all the prisons of the land are daily pestered and stuffed full of them, where either they pitifully pine away or are miserably hanged. How much better, Hakluyt suggested evangelically, to put the wretches to work in a colony overseas. So again, it's being suggested again that these people that filled up the prisons and are either pitifully pining away or miserably hanged, suggest instead of hanging them, let's put them to work in the colonies overseas, he says. It says he railed off a list of America's resources and set out the different industries that could flourish there, which was propaganda again. All they were going there to do was work in the tobacco fields. So later on, after the 16th century came the 17th century and the enclosure laws. It says the enclosure laws had driven British small farmers and village dwellers off the land and into the cities where they gathered and loitered, a threat to the order and comfort of the property classes. 17th and 18th century economists advocated the enslavement of poor whites because they saw them as the cheapest and most effective way to develop the colonies in the New World and expand the British Empire. It was claimed that by making slave laborers out of poor whites, they were saved from being otherwise chargeable and unprofitable to the realm. As the plantation system expanded in the Southern American colonies, planters demanded the legalization of the practice of kidnapping poor whites. As it stood, laws were on the books forbidding kidnapping, but these were for show and were enforced with very infrequent token arrests of spirits. The planters' need for white slave labor expanded to such an extent that they tired of having to operate in a quasi-legal manner. In response, in February 1652, it was enacted that it may be lawful for two or more justices of the peace within any county, city, or town, corporate belonging to this commonwealth, to from time to time by warrant cause to be apprehended, seized on a detained, all and every person or persons that shall be found begging and vagrant in any town, parish, or place to be conveyed into the port of London, or onto any other port, from where such person or persons may be shipped into foreign colony or plantation. So in the 17th and 18th century, which 16th, 1700s, they had legalized enslaving white people, especially those criminals sentenced to death. And once they got over here, this is what they suggested. The merchant Joshua G. proposed giving them frontier land and using them as a bulwark against the Native Americans. Now, look up the word bulwark. It means a defensive wall. So they wanted to use the white slaves as a wall between them and the attacking Indians. It goes on to say, Hunter found it difficult to impose his will upon the recalcitrant workforce. Many Germans carried guns provided by the British for defense against the indigenous tribes. So again, these Germans or these slaves were given guns, and they acted as a defensive wall in between the attacking Indians and the aristocracy, which were the slave plantation owners of white slaves. And then when it comes to the slave hunts, the runaway slave laws, all that refers to the white slaves. White slaves who ran away found safe haven in portions of North Carolina, which became known in Virginia as the refuge of runaways. The mountains of Appalachia also served as hideouts for fugitive white slaves. The hunting of white slaves became a lucrative practice. In Virginia in 1699, persons who successfully hunted a white slave received 1,000 pounds of tobacco, paid for by the future labor that would be extracted from the white slave. Check out what it says right here. It's talking about how in the fictional film Glory, how the whips were on the so-called black soldiers. It says, yet in reality, among the white soldiers in that scene, there would have been more than a few who also bore the massive scars from a whip, or who had seen the scars of the lash on their white fathers' backs. The current image of blacks as predominantly the ones who bore the scars of the whiplash is in error. Now listen to this. On September 20th, 1776, right, that's right, going into the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress authorized the whipping of unruly American enlisted men with up to 100 lashes. There are cases on record of rank and file white American troops receiving up to 250 whiplashes. So they militarized the white slaves and they were still whipping them even in the military. Now, this is the interesting part because everybody talks about how the founding fathers owned slaves and this and that. Yeah, but they own white slaves. In Virginia, more than 2,000 miles away from Barbados, most of the indigenous population had been cleared from the tidewater on the eastern shores of the Chesapeake. Now, in 1646, somewhere around there, it was called the Red Line. That's where redlining started. It started with the Powhatan Confederacy of Indians in Virginia right there. But it says in the middle decades of the 17th century, which would have been after the Third Powhatan War, and where it says indigenous populations were cleared from the eastern shores of the Chesapeake, that's what that's referring to. It says in the middle decades of the 17th century, roots were laid down for an aristocracy that would dominate Virginia for 200 years. Now, from the middle of the 1600s, 200 years from that is to the middle of the 1800s, when we said the white slavery was taken away with the emancipation during the 1860s. Well, it goes on to say that men whose descendants would include some of America's most reverend leaders were busy building their fortunes. The first Washington, the first Madison, and the first Lee. Now, when it says they were busy building their fortunes, that meant off the backs of enslaved white people.
RN, Aaliyah, the RN. Aaliyah. Aaliyah, turn your microphone on, ma'am.
Oh, hello? Oh, my goodness. Okay, Tariq, I'm gonna get to the point. My family is from Buffalo, New York. I'm Native American. We owned 10,000 white slaves. We owned 10,000 white slaves. And I just wanted to let you know, my last name is Holland. We still have the Holland Land Trust. When the people of non-FBA come over here, it's like we're the Palestinians versus Israel. They stole our land. They stole our land. They stole our land. We also owned Seneca Village. They stole our land. They stole our land. They stole our land. So this is more ammunition. Like I get furious when I hear immigrants come over here and just disrespect us. We have to start thinking from a place like Palestinian. They came over here. They asked to come over here. With my family, they only brought white slaves. They only brought white slaves. I'm supposed to be related to Joe Biden. It's my cousin. I met Leona Helmsley. She's my cousin. Mariah Carey is supposed to be my cousin. Josephine Baker and this mega pastor, A.R. Bernard. But their white family was slaves on my family plantation. Their white family was slaves. White family was slaves on my family plantation. Plantation. And they were sent over here as convicts to work. Convicts to work. They're dead off to Britain. And a lot of the documents is fake. It's this organization with NASA. They spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars to erase our history. But they can't. And I wanted us to go back and look at. It's easier to trace how our stuff was stolen from us. It's easier to trace how our stuff was stolen from us. Than to find our 256 grandmother that was here millions of years ago. It's like how you.
Thank you so much, beloved. Let's get Mark in here, Mark.
Now to jump over to something else, there's something unique about the Civil War and how the Union or Abraham Lincoln treated the white slaves. It says the Compensated Emancipation Act of 1862 says, with a stroke of his pen, President Abraham Lincoln signed into law the Compensated Emancipation Act on April 16, 1862, officially ending slavery in Washington, D.C. The act reflected a new direction in the long-standing debate over slavery and emancipation in the nation's capital. While a far cry from full emancipation, it was an important step towards the abolition of slavery. The law ending slavery in the nation's capital provided compensation for the owners of the roughly 3,185 slaves it freed. A third-person commission heard petitions of the former slave owners and made determinations on how much money they should receive for the loss of their human property. In the end, the total compensation amounted to nearly $1 million. A second Compensation Act, which Lincoln signed into law on July 12, 1862, allowed former slaves to petition for reimbursement for their own value, so long as their former masters had not already been compensated. It also allowed former slaves who had purchased the freedom of family members to claim remuneration for the money they had spent to free loved ones. This corrected a flaw in the original act. Under the original law, black claims were automatically discounted if challenged by a white petitioner. And they say this is just in Washington, D.C., but it happened all over the place. They were paying the slave owners, people like Andrew Johnson in Tennessee, paying him for his white slaves so that his white slaves could go into the military.
Sir, it's foundational Black American culture. What's yours? What's your culture? Wow, you get real quiet, don't you? Okay, Ahmad. So the fact that you can't even name what your culture is, when you come in these spaces, don't say somebody's trying to hate on you. And you don't have nothing to hate on. You can't even name something that we hate on. You understand how that works, Ahmad? You don't have nothing for us to hate on. Therefore, we're not hating on you.
The point I was trying to make is you're just, you're very, you just like to just, hate on East Africans, for no reason. I don't understand why you hate East Africans.
Sir, you're just talking in circles. You just basically admitted you have nothing, not even a culture to hate on, sir. I gave you an opportunity to name this culture. You couldn't name one thing, sir. Not one.
Yeah, but you're trying to say that FBA is not African. They're not Africans. They're originally from Africa. That's
Sir,
what I don't understand.
everybody comes from Africa.
No.
Africa. Yes, they do.
No.
Yes, they do. Africa. Yes, they do.
No.
But our culture is distinct from African culture. And you tried to say hip hop was African, and then I said name an MC comparable to a foundational Black American, and you couldn't do that, sir. Why? Why couldn't you do that if we're all the same?
Wait, how are you saying everyone's come from Africa? And you're like, aren't you a historian? Don't you know about history? Aren't you a historian? Don't you know about history? Aren't you a historian? Don't you know about history? How are you saying everyone's come from Africa? How are you saying everyone's come from Africa? Don't you know about history?
Yeah, everybody's DNA. Everybody came out of Africa. Africa was the birthplace of mankind. Every human being can trace their lineage back to Africa. Right?
Nah, that doesn't make sense.
How does that not make sense? This is science, sir. The first people on the planet out of Africa, then they walked around the planet. They traveled around the planet. They sailed around the planet. They started from Africa, sir. Just Google the out of Africa theory. The out of Africa theory. Just Google the theory.